Hello, Unisanu students, staff, and faculty. My name is Loren Tousant. I'm a professor of psychology at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, in the United States. I'm very honored and thrilled to be part of the Unisanu Perdona campaign. And I want to say a special thank you to Andrea Ortega Bichara for offering me the opportunity to speak with you today. I want to say thank you again for the opportunity to be part of Unisanu Perdona campaign. I truly appreciate the opportunity and want to say thank you again to all Unisanu students, staff, and faculty, and especially an extra big thank you to Andrea Ortega Bicharo for the invitation to be part of this truly incredible opportunity. Hi, my name is Loren Tousant, and I'm a professor of psychology at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, in the United States. I'm honored to be asked to speak with you today about a very important topic. The topic you can see on the screen is forgiveness and community well-being. Oftentimes people think they know what forgiveness is and they think they're doing a really good job of being a forgiving person, but sometimes there's some important things that we're not aware of, and I wanted to share some of those things with you today, especially as they relate to improving our communities and the places that we live. So let's get started. It turns out that there's problems in our communities, and those problems have to do with stress, conflict, and injustice that we experience in our communities. Where do these things come from? Well, they come from all kinds of places in our communities. They come from our schools, they come from our families, they come from our workplaces, and they also come from other organizations and places like religious institutions. These are places where we sometimes hurt other people and we oftentimes hurt ourselves. So the community environment is one in which we're very likely to either be hurt or to hurt someone in. It's just kind of a standard part of being a human being in a community. Well, what's wrong with that is that when we feel like we have hurt someone or someone has hurt us, it creates an injustice. That injustice is oftentimes something that creates unforgiveness in us, and unforgiveness in us is something that causes stress. It's not very comfortable for us to feel unforgiving about something that someone has done to us or something that we have done to others. In any case, creates a stressful, kind of anxious state of affairs for us. And this has all kinds of consequences. Psychologically, it impacts our mental and our physical well-being. It impacts our behavior, and sometimes we might choose to act in ways that are not very healthy. We might turn to using substances, alcohol, or other drugs as ways of coping. It sometimes impairs our thinking and makes it difficult for us to see clearly and to think clearly about the world around us. It also has what we call psychoendocrine effects, and that is to say that the stress response has ultimately hormonal consequences, stress hormones that are released in response to these stressful circumstances. We also have what are often called psychophysiological responses, and these are things like sweating or rapid heartbeat, or sometimes high blood pressure would be considered a psychophysiological response to stress. And then finally, we have a number of social consequences that when we're under stress, we oftentimes don't relate very well to one another, and we tend to run short on patience or other kinds of things that make it difficult for us to get along with each other. So unforgiveness really is tied up in stress, and stress is tied up in all of these consequences that are kind of negative and not very healthy or pleasant for us as individuals or as communities. So let's think about the concept of forgiveness, because it's more than likely, as I've just indicated, it's more than likely that we're going to need it. Whether we're hurt at school or in the workplace, whether we're hurt at home or we are hurt in our faith communities or other community organizations that we're part of. Chances are very good we're going to have to deal with the issue of forgiving someone else at some point in our lifetime. And so it's good that we review a little bit what exactly is our understanding of forgiveness. And so at a very bare minimum, I might say that forgiveness is letting go, releasing the negative stuff that is part of that hurt experience. If someone hurt you or if you hurt someone else and you feel unforgiveness, it's really the kind of negative emotional, negative thinking or beliefs and negative behaviors that we're talking about letting go of here. Now, it would be nice if that's all we needed to do, but typically forgiveness really does require more. It requires that we build back the positive affect, that is the positive emotions, the positive beliefs, and the positive behaviors toward the offending agent. It's important to remember that sometimes we have to forgive others, but probably just as often we need to forgive ourselves. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that is distinguished a little bit later. It's different ways of thinking about forgiving yourself versus forgiving others. We need to keep in mind that some people are just really forgiving folks, and we call those folks people that are high in trait forgiveness. They have a characteristic or a trait that that really makes them forgiving people, compared to all of us who can feel very forgiving in a certain state, in a certain place or a time, but it may not be a particular trait that is characteristic of us. So we distinguish between trait forgiveness, that is people who are forgiving as kind of part of their character, maybe even a virtue, and people who experience the state, the kind of fleeting state of forgiveness that may come or go depending on the circumstances. And then finally, we need to be clear that forgiveness is something that we can either kind of in our head decide to do and make it a kind of a cognitive thought-based thing. You might plan how you want to go about doing this, or forgiveness might be something that is really a full emotional, deeply felt experience that activates all kinds of emotional responses, some of which might impact the way that you think, some of which might impact simply the way you feel or experience yourself in the very moment. So we think there's lots of different ways to think about forgiveness, but these are really key aspects of those definitions of forgiveness: letting go of negative affect, developing positive affect, letting go of negative beliefs, developing positive beliefs, letting go of negative behaviors, developing positive behaviors, and then thinking about the difference between others versus self, trait versus state, decisional versus emotional forgiveness. So that kind of sums up the way that we think about forgiveness. Now, what about, sometimes people might say, well, I'm thinking I would like to forgive this person, or I would like to forgive myself, and I just don't know that I can do it. I don't know that I can muster the energy and the commitment to forgive. That really is a question of the motivation that one has to forgive. And motivation is kind of a tricky concept to think about. What is it that makes you do what you do? That's really what we're asking here, because we might be thinking about wanting you to forgive. Well, what makes you want to forgive, or what makes you want to not forgive? What are those things? Well, social learning theory is a decades-old theory in social psychology that says that people kind of develop a motivation, a desire to want to do something based on three major factors. Those three things are: one, models, and you can find models of forgiving people in your family, in your schools, in your organizations, especially in organizational leadership, maybe presidents or governors or other people, religious leaders, all kinds of examples of people that are forgiving folks. So that's one thing that motivates you according to social learning theory, to want to, make this kind of change is that you see other people, notable people, who are forgiving people. The second thing that you need is self-efficacy, and that is the belief that you can forgive, the understanding that you're capable of doing it. And then finally, you have to believe in positive outcome expectancies. That is, if you forgive, good things are going to happen. You have to really hold that close to your heart, that good things are going to come from this, because it might really be hard to do. So if we think about models of forgiveness, there are lots of models of forgiveness, but I name a couple that are probably very notable to you. Desmond Tutu is widely known as being a very forgiving individual. Nelson Mandela, also likewise very well known. But other individuals, if you Google Sammy Rangel, Mary Johnston, and O'Shea Israel, if you Google the Amish faith and learn a little bit about some of the struggles that they've experienced and how forgiveness is woven into their culture, you will find ample examples of models. And as I say, you probably don't need to, Google notable people, but think of people that are close to you, people in your lives, people in your work, in your family, in your faith organizations, who you think of as forgiving people. And this will help you identify someone who you might be able to kind of pattern after, to follow after in terms of trying to be a forgiving person. Remember, self-efficacy is a very important part of it. And you have to believe that if other people can be forgiving people, you can be too. And oftentimes we measure this on a scale of simply, no confidence in your ability to forgive to complete confidence in your ability to forgive. And typically when you start the process, you probably don't have a lot of confidence. It's something that you have to build. You have to build self-efficacy. And with every model that you read about or that you find in your life, who's doing well because they have forgiven, you develop maybe greater confidence that you too can do this, especially if there are people that are similar to you in some ways. You might say, hey, if they can do it, I can do it as well. So if you have found models, if you've developed some self-confidence and some self-efficacy in forgiving, and you believe, remember, in those positive outcome expectancies, you believe that the outcome of forgiveness will be a good one, then the next question is, how do you do it? How do you're motivated, you feel, you see other people that are forgiving and have done well being forgiving people. You maybe think to yourself that you're confident that you can do this yourself. And so you might decide you want to do it. And so you're ready, but you just don't know what to do. Well, thankfully, there are many scientifically proven effective means of forgiving. And one that I'll briefly mention here today is called the REACH model of forgiveness. It starts with remembering. So it starts with that aspect of remembering why you want to do this in the first place. Why have you a need to forgive? Remember what the hurt is, who hurt you, and what the problem is. Number two is empathize. Empathize with your offender. Think about what may have led them to hurt you in the first place. Might be a certain context in their life. They maybe really grew up in bad circumstances, and maybe you can understand how they might have hurt somebody growing up in those circumstances. Maybe you realize that they were seeing the world in a particular way that made them do what they did. Maybe you find that there were the ways that they were thinking about the world at that time that were causing them to act in a particular way. But the really important part of this process is probably number one, empathizing with your offender, and everything else kind of follows from that. So you're going to try to remember the reason why you need to forgive in the first place. Number two, you're going to try to empathize with your offender, as hard as that might seem. Number three, you're going to think about giving forgiveness as truly an altruistic gift. Now, what is altruism? It is good that is done for another person with absolutely no intention of receiving something on your behalf. Now, some people might argue whether there is any true altruism in this world, but I'm going to take as an assumption that there is. People can do truly altruistic acts, and they do them all the time. And so think about giving an undeserved gift of forgiveness to your offender. Think about the benefits it might have for you, in that act of altruism. You might yourself find some satisfaction or some relief. And oftentimes that's what we do when we engage in altruism. We act in the best interests of other people, and yet it brings us some joy in doing that. Well, if you can offer an altruistic gift of forgiveness, then you're faced with the issue of committing to it, and remaining committed to forgiveness is a hard thing to do. Sometimes it's easier to make a decision to do something, and it's harder to actually continue to commit to doing it. So we need to commit to forgiving, and we need to hold on to forgiveness when it gets tough, because sometimes we might be, mildly offended again, and we find that it's really difficult to remain a forgiving person in that circumstance. And that's okay. It's important to know that you're going to have challenges, and that you need to hold on to your commitment and overcome those challenges. And what that may mean is that you need to re-enter this entire process again, with remembering what was done, empathizing, offering the altruistic gift, committing, and holding on again. So this might be thought of as kind of instead of thinking of it as a line that starts at one place, start here and finish here, you might think of it as a process that kind of continues to roll onward throughout life. Now, this is what we think about as one of the most well-established, scientifically validated processes of going through forgiveness. But keep in mind, the top of this slide is titled Forgive Others. What if you have to forgive yourself? Well, a similar process is available. It starts with a different kind of thing, and it ends with kind of a different kind of thing. But again, it's kind of circular in its process, indicating that as you go through life, you may need to kind of re-enter this again. So let's start again with apologizing. If you need to forgive yourself, it means you've done something wrong, probably to someone else. And in that event, the best thing to do is to apologize to the person that you have hurt, if that is possible, and if it is a safe thing to do. If it's not possible, if it's not a safe thing to do, you might even begin this process by symbolically doing something to apologize that might then lead you to attempting to make amends. And again, it would be great if you could make amends directly with the person that you hurt. If that's not possible, maybe something symbolic could be done. If you hurt someone and really offended, let's say your daughter, you might say, my daughter's a long ways away, and maybe I don't want to bring this up with her. Maybe you think about spending some time offering volunteering resources, or just trying to support your a young women's community organization that tries to build up women and help them with education, and those kinds of things might be helpful. But we start with apologizing. We try to make amends either in some kind of real way or some symbolic way if necessary. And then we accept the fact that we need to forgive ourselves. That's the third thing in this model here. Being forgiven is a big step. If you've apologized, you've made amends, or you've done the best of those things that you possibly can do, then you need to forgive yourself and accept that you have been, leading to the fourth step here, which is accept that you have been healed in some way. You did something wrong. You tried to do your best to make it right. You've forgiven yourself. You need to accept yourself as a remade person, someone who has now forgiven themselves. Well, what does that mean? If you're remade, you need to work toward improvement so that you don't make these same mistakes again in the future. It would be terrible to say, well, I forgave myself so I can go on now and make those same mistakes again with other people in the future. That's not what we want. We need to accept ourselves as a person who is moving forward, having experienced some brokenness, and trying to look to the future where you are now going to try to improve the person that you are. Notice that working on self-improvement is an important thing, but it also leads to commitment. It's easy to say that you want to lose weight, or you might want to exercise more, or you might want to become a person that reads more, or prays more, or is more religious, or any number of things that you might want to do. It's easy to say that you want to improve yourself in these ways. It's hard to stay committed to those things. And so the last step of this model is to remain committed to not only forgiving yourself, but also improving yourself so that going forward, self-forgiveness is less necessary. The important part of this, again, is to remember that this could be a cyclical process that you might need to re-enter again in the future. And just like forgiving others is likely to be something that you're going to continue to work through in this kind of cycle of steps, it's very likely that you may need to do the self-forgiveness, or forgiving oneself. You may need to do that again and again as you go forward in life. Well, ultimately, understanding forgiveness is an important thing for an individual. Understanding the process and the motivation of forgiveness is a very important thing. But ultimately, we might say it's most important because it builds our community. It's good if I can be a forgiving person. It's good if you can be a forgiving person. But most importantly would be if we can build a forgiving community, one that is truly forgiving and embraces the notion of forgiveness in every possible way. And that's really hard, unless you have forgiving people that are the components of forgiving communities. Well, what are the key aspects of a forgiving community? Well, one, you have to have a community that's conducive to forgiveness. It creates an environment that is conducive to forgiveness. That is a community where you prize justice. It's hard to be a forgiving person if you fear that people are going to harm you again. So you have to have a community that prizes safety. And ultimately, it has to be a community that values forgiveness. If your community doesn't value forgiveness, you're probably not going to become a forgiving community, because you're not going to see it as being a valuable thing to strive for. Earlier, in talking about social learning theory, we said you need to have models and leaders that people can pattern themselves after in terms of forgiveness. Well, in communities, it's crucially important that you find good leaders and good models who can really provide that example of forgiveness. If you think about South Africa, you think about Nelson Mandela, you think about the model of forgiveness that he provided for an entire nation, and those are the things that are key in building forgiving communities. You need to have opportunities to forgive. You need to have support for forgiveness. It's a hard thing to do. And so it's not easy for individuals to create an opportunity to work through the forgiveness process. They may not feel able that they're, well suited to forgive on their own. They may need to find places where they can go and work through forgiveness. In the United States, we have many different support groups that are available for people who are caring for others that have significant medical needs. We might have a support group for people who have lost a family member or a loved one to an illness or to natural death, or whatever the case might be. We have support groups for people who are struggling with substance abuse, alcohol, and other drugs. Many of these support groups are widely available. They're available in almost every community. in our country. And wouldn't it be great if we had a community that prized forgiveness and created very widely available opportunities for support in the forgiveness process? Well, in forgiving communities, we have to have a forgiveness process, and we've outlined two of those processes earlier in terms of forgiving others and seeking forgiveness for yourself. In both cases, these are important elements to flesh out more fully. I couldn't possibly describe to you all of the components of forgiving others and forgiving yourself in the short few minutes that I spent talking about them. I simply hope that I maybe whetted your appetite for thinking about these processes more deeply. There are many resources available, as I said, that can help if you want to dig deeper into the processes. But it's very important that you have a process, a method, especially one that's scientifically validated, like the REACH model of forgiveness, so that you can be assured that you are going to enter into a process that will lead you to a place that will allow you to be a more forgiving person. Forgiving communities have policies that embrace forgiveness, that make forgiveness something that's not only possible, but something that's promoted, something that leaders promote, that organizations, businesses, faith communities have policies in place that help people to forgive. If you go to a workplace and there's no policy on forgiveness and how to work through it when you have a problem with a coworker, you probably aren't going to do it. So forgiving communities have organizations and businesses and places that support forgiving policies. And finally, forgiving communities are places where forgiveness is widely known about. You're exposed to it frequently and it's promoted widely. That's the kind of thing that's difficult to do at the start, but eventually you hope that the community will embrace forgiveness. And in so doing, opportunities for being exposed to forgiveness will grow, and forgiveness promotion will become simply part of the fabric of the community. Simply put, the community will provide forgiveness as kind of the most common option when you've been hurt. So lots of things to think about as you think about building a forgiving community, but I've tried to outline just a few of those things here. I find this quote to be kind of interesting and useful. It's the 5 by 5 rule. Sometimes people can get really wrapped up in issues that seem really difficult, and I like the context that this gives. It says, if it's not going to matter in 5 years, don't spend more than 5 minutes upset by it. Let the tide wash it away. And I think oftentimes that's an important thing for us to think about, is that as a community, we want to be a community that forgives easily, that does not get hung up on small matters that then sometimes grow into very large and significant concerns, but rather it's a community that stays focused on what's important, and that is being a forgiving community, being a community that can reconcile with one another, and being a community that can remain productive. So I urge you to be a daily forgiveness hero. And what that means is you're a humble forgiveness hero that might be kind of quiet about your strength. You don't advertise it, but you internalize it. You really feel that strength within you. And you recognize that you're capable of forgiving and moving on. And you hope that you're building a community where others will be that too. That each day you might be able to consider the possibility that you could be a forgiveness hero and move on and move forward and stay focused on the positive things in your life, not get hung up on small issues. Well, if you're able to develop a forgiveness strength within you, you're able to forgive yourself, you're able to forgive others, you're even able to support the notion of a forgiving community, then what are the benefits of that? Well, there are many scientific papers that we've published and that other people have published on the topic of the rewards of forgiveness. But I want to highlight just a couple of those things today because I think it really applies to both the individual and to the community as you think about what are the benefits of forgiveness. Well, when you think about the benefits of forgiveness, two key areas are in terms of your health and occupational outcomes. You can see that I've outlined here. Forgiveness might impact your mental health, your physical health, your productivity, as well as absenteeism at work. And that's exactly what we found in a sample of just over 100 office workers in Washington, D.C. in the United States. We found that same result in about 150 Midwestern manufacturing employees. We found the same sorts of connections between forgiveness and mental health, physical health, productivity, and in this case, work stress. And I'm going to put a kind of complicated picture on the screen here, but ultimately what this says is that trait forgiveness is related to fewer negative occupational outcomes, those things being unproductivity, psychological distress, and physical illness symptoms. And forgiveness is connected to these things largely because it decreases workplace interpersonal stress. And if you decrease interpersonal stress in the workplace, you have fewer negative occupational outcomes. Now, if you think about that in terms of the broader perspective in not only your occupation, but in your other organizations, in your community, in your neighborhoods, in your families, in your faith communities, this might say a lot, that being a forgiving person, becoming someone who is a forgiving person, can decrease a lot of interpersonal stress, and it can be related to better, just in general, life outcomes and quality of life. In addition, what we found is that oftentimes stress is related to poor health and work problems, and that is true for people who are low and medium forgivers. But what we found is that for people who are high in forgiveness, the connection between stress and health issues, health problems and work problems, is literally erased from a statistical standpoint. People that have strong levels of forgiveness show virtually no connection between stress and the negative outcomes that stress typically brings about. That is health and work problems, problems in your families, and other things in your communities. So in some ways, you might even say forgiveness protects you from the negative outcomes, the negative consequences of living with stress in your life. And finally, I'll simply add that in a study of about 100 financial service advisors, these are people that are working in the finance world, managing a lot of money, pretty stressful occupation. They completed 1 day of forgiveness training and then some follow-up coaching over the course of the next few months. And the results showed that they had improved health, as we would expect, given what I've just said. But the results also showed a 20% increase in sales and productivity. And that's a pretty significant improvement, all from 1 day of forgiveness training and a little bit of coaching. So forgiveness has lots of benefits to your mental health, your physical health, your productivity, your ability to show up for work. Lots of good reasons why, even though someone may not technically deserve forgiveness. Remember, we talked about that idea of forgiveness being an altruistic act. They don't deserve it. But if you're able to give it, the great thing is that you end up receiving some rewards as well. A lot of this has been summarized in a book that we developed a few years ago now. I was lucky enough to do this with some very highly esteemed colleagues, Dr. Everett Worthington and Dr. David R. Williams. And we looked more closely at the benefits of forgiveness for health and found a number of connections between forgiveness and mental and physical and social well-being. And so I mentioned that as a resource if you'd like to know more about this connection. Finally, I'd like to say that, as I said earlier, I'm coming to you from Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, in the United States. My email is listed here on the left-hand side of the screen, as well as my phone number. I suspect if you have questions, you might be eager to get answers to those questions, and I would encourage you to do just that. Be in touch with me. I love to hear from people about forgiveness, and so I'd be happy to speak with you about it. And finally, I'll say one last very significant thank you for the invitation to speak on the topic of forgiveness. I think it is one of the most important things for our communities and for the individuals that live in those communities. So one last thank you, and especially thank you to Andrea for inviting me. I'm very, very honored to be able to do this for you. Thank you so much.